Hi, welcome to episode 100 of Talk About the Passion. This is the second in a series of videos I'm going to be doing with this podcast moving forward. And I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. If you watched the first one I did with Brian Brannon of JFA, please let me know if you watched that and what you thought. Moving forward, this episode is just a short discussion on how I came up with the name for this podcast and just a couple stupid stories about when I was younger and that kind of thing. Next week, we'll be back with more interviews and that kind of thing and discussions on records. And I got a bunch of cool episodes and guests coming up in the future. So yeah, here's episode 100. Hi, welcome to episode 100 of Talk About the Passion. 100 episodes seems like a lot, and it is for sure, but it would certainly be higher if I didn't take so many random breaks. But here we are. Well, whether you're new here since you heard someone you liked on here and started following, or someone who has listened all along, thanks for doing that. I plan on doing many more of these. I initially wanted the 100th episode to maybe be someone popular, but then I realized I could use this opportunity to just talk by myself again, as I've been trying to do here more often, since I've come back from the 2-year hiatus, and I just didn't have anyone booked to come on here, so here I am. So if you have listened to this podcast for a while, you probably noticed it's mostly people from hardcore and metal music worlds, or heavy music in general. So why is this podcast named after an REM song that's reportedly about hunger? Also, I don't think you've ever even mentioned the band REM on an episode. Well, I can give you 2 answers for that. The first is the fact that it's an REM song is less important than I hope to literally just talk to people about their passions, which I think I've done quite a bit here, as well as my own, of course. Also, that simply can't be true that I've never talked about the band or the song. Oh wait, I have multiple times. Early on, I would end episodes telling people to search for me online, but make sure to search for Talk About the Passion podcast and not just Talk About the Passion, or you'd end up with that REM song, like that was some sort of undesirable fate. And I guess it would be if you came here because of, one of my conversations about, hard rock and metal with, Bob Mayo of Wargasm, and you end up with that REM song in your earbuds. You may not like that, and for that I apologize. I promise not to send anyone on, such a harrowing journey again. The other reason this podcast is named after an REM song about hunger is completely made up, but now that I know the background of this song, the lyrics, I figured I could sneak that narrative in and make me sound more clever and deliberate than I am. Yeah, I hunger for discussion about music, which I admit is true. They say a lot of music from when you are between 10 and 30 defines you, which I think is semi-accurate. I'd go more like 10 to 20. And for some young people, it was sort of an unwritten rule that you couldn't cross genres with your music. If you were a new wave or at an Exodus concert, you're going to get harassed. Also, if you were like a fake metalhead, and the singer used to point out posers in the audience and direct the Exodus fans to beat up any poser, and then take their shirt and rip it and wear it as like a badge of honor, something like that. Someone comment and let us know what happened with the Exodus calling out posers in the crowd. So this happened to me at numerous periods in my life. Well, it didn't happen like that, but there have been rumored times where I've been trapped between a couple of different worlds that should never mix. If you were around in the late 70s, you may remember the Disco Sucks movement. Yeah, people just hated disco music and wanted it to end. Wink. In 1978, when I was 8 years old, I went to a day camp called the Ranch Club in Chatsworth, California. I've never been able to find out much information about this camp aside from it was opened in 1973 by someone named Leon Fenwick, and the area is mostly known as Stony Point. Some famous films and TV shows have been filmed here, like Seinfeld, early Superman, and I think there's a picture that was used as a promo for the Grapes of Wrath movie that was used here. Oh yeah, and this camp was also, and you can look this up on a map. It's right over the hill from Spahn Ranch. In 1978, it was, it really wasn't that long ago that some fun things were happening over there. But you can probably hear about that on a true crime podcast. Or I'm sure, like me, you have a handful of people obsessed with Charles Manson shit. So I went to this camp a few times a week and got in with the troublemakers pretty quick. Yeah, even at 8 years old, I was kind of a piece of shit. When we first moved to Los Angeles, we moved to an area called Encino in the San Fernando Valley. And we ended up in an apartment building on Balboa Boulevard, which is still there, called the Balboa Biltmore. And it was owned by one of my dad's bosses, Jerry Moss, who was the M in A&M Records. At one point, I started a fire in the laundromat there, which caused some kind of situation for my parents, I'm sure. I was 7. So at one point, the camp was going to have an overnight camping night, and I was going to attend. I'd never stayed away from my family ever at this point, aside from at relatives' houses. So I signed on for this overnight thing. I was going to meet my friends Brent, who was around my age, or Brett, I think. Brett or Brent. He lived on my street. Little blonde kid. And this older kid, Kevin, who was sort of our leader. He was older, and I often wonder how much older. I imagine he was like 11 or 12, but it seemed like he was a teenager. He was significantly bigger than us, and his most striking feature was he wore one of those brass Kiss belt buckles. You know the one, it was just the logo. I had the oval one, which had the Kiss logo in sparkly letters. And in retrospect, I think I had the cooler one. And I also, paired mine with an Ace Frehley shirt, the one with his guitarist smoking. So, that's cool you like Kiss, Kevin, but I'm so hardcore I need to show my love for a specific member of the band, Ace Frehley. Even if deep down I was a Peter Criss guy, kid. Oh yeah, so 1978, Kiss was the band. It was easy to find other kids into the same music even at this age. So I loved Kiss and wanted to make sure anyone on the outside knew I was a card-carrying member of the Kiss Army, and that was that. However, I led a much darker life at home where I was also a huge fan of disco music. Specifically the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack or anything the Bee Gees did. I also loved the soundtrack to Grease, specifically the theme song to Grease sung by Frankie Valli but written by Barry Gibb. These were certainly red flags that would surely have anyone thrown out of the Kiss Army with a dishonorable discharge faster than you can say, hey, what about I Was Made for Loving You and Strutter 78? I certainly could never let the leader of my gang at camp know I was also a disco kid. So the plan was we would meet up during the sleepover and then go do a bunch of shit we weren't supposed to do. I'm not exactly sure what would that would entail, covering things in toilet paper, smoking cigarettes. I was 4 years away from starting smoking anyway, so 8 wouldn't have been that bad. Sneaking into the girls' tents, 8 years old. The night of the sleepover, though, as soon as the sun went down, I just wasn't feeling it, apparently. I had some sort of anxiety attack, and I had the staff call my parents so I could go back home to the safety of my disco and Kiss-filled bedroom at home. The next day, I went back to camp, and that kid Kevin cornered me and asked why I pussied out. He heard I called my parents and went home. I shrugged and ended up leaving the gang life behind that day. Or, the life of being kind of a bully or tough kid. As far as I know, Kevin never found out about my love for disco and the Grease soundtrack, a love that continues to this day. I wonder what happened to him when they would put out I Was Made for Loving You. Fast forward a couple of years later, we're back in Massachusetts, and I'm now 11 years old, skateboarding down the street in Nahant, Mass. I think I've told this story on this podcast before. Skateboarding wasn't huge here in what would have been 1981. At least I think it wasn't. At least as far as I remember. I was wearing a Van Halen 2 shirt and turned a corner to come face to face with a group of older kids who surrounded me and were going to take my skateboard. One older kid steps forward and said, hey, leave this kid alone. He has good taste in music. And then he let me ride through the group. Thanks, unknown fellow burnout, and thank you, Van Halen 2. I'll always stand up for you as well. I did end up falling in with a group of friends lovingly called burnouts throughout junior high, which I think is one of the hardest times in a teenager's life, at least as far as finding an identity. Music was definitely something that, brought you together with new kids, but so is Dungeons & Dragons, sci-fi and fantasy books, smoking cigarettes and weed, drinking alcohol, and all around, doing things that were mind-expanding but also brain cell destroying. The Rush song Subdivisions perfectly encapsulated, my experience as a teenager, and I've talked about that song and that band at this time in my life extensively on this podcast. But yeah, that song, and specifically from that record, Signals, which came out around the same time, was a big deal for me. It was a beautiful time for sure. I was also, a big fan of Ozzy Osbourne, Sabbath with Dio, and Iron Maiden. But also, we started getting records at the house, like the first B-52s record, Pat Benatar, the Pretenders, the Clash, Devo, and the Cars. There's no denying any of that music to this day, so it's so odd to me there was ever a time in my life when people wouldn't mix the genres up, at least as far as in social circles. Once we started watching MTV, that changed it a little bit, but you still had your allegiances. Sure, you could give a nod to the fix on the TV, but you certainly weren't going to see them. This group of friends was sort of transitional as I met my friend Peter, who would introduce me to hardcore music, and I then pretty much took a completely different journey than all of them. No regrets. You know how they say people who constantly accuse you of something are probably guilty of it themselves? When I was a teenager, I was in a hardcore band called Shattered Silence. Initially, I played bass, and my best friend at the time, John Kelleher Jr., played drums. Al Quint sang, and his friend George Belly played guitar. I switched to vocals on a couple of songs, one a cover of Faith's Limitations, Negative Approach, Nothing, and then an original I wrote the lyrics to called the Aquanet Crew. Even at 55 years old, I can experience shame and embarrassment, so I'm not going to repeat any of the lyrics here, but you could probably find it somehow if you use Google. But this song was essentially making fun of the Cure and the Smiths, two bands I was also huge fans of at the time. My first girlfriend in high school was into stuff like Tom Petty and INXS. Her and her best friend at the time used to talk about this cute guy who was kind of like a Jake Ryan from 16 Candles type guy, but also quiet and mysterious. There were always these good-looking, quiet, and mysterious kids you had to deal with in high school. At least if you were hanging out in circles where, girls read books and were in the drama club, not cheerleaders and preps. Girls who had brains. I was never going to be these dudes, though. I had acne and a mustache. At one point, my brother got us tickets to see The Cure at the Orpheum in Boston. It was October 25th, 1985. The show, not when he got the tickets. The Head on the Door tour. I had just been getting into them myself. A couple of days before the concert, though, I found out my girlfriend and her friend would be attending a party the same night of the concert that was rumored to also include that new quiet and mysterious guy. So I, of course, now wanted to go to this party to make sure nothing happened. I tried to get out of going to the show, but my mother intervened and I went to the show, which is amazing, of course, especially when you look back at the set list now. They played every song from The Head on the Door except The Blood, and did 3 different encores ending with a cover of Do You Want to Touch. A fun time was had by all. And I saw numerous shows like this between 1984 and the early 90s, from the Smiths and New Order in 84, to OMD, Cocteau Twins, the Sugar Cubes, and the list goes on. I don't know why I always downplayed this kind of stuff as part of my personality, but I did, well, aside from wearing bangles and button-down sweaters with a Smiths shirt under. I didn't. I took my girlfriend to numerous hardcore shows throughout our relationship, and she genuinely liked some of the stuff like Scream and, that Black Flag record, Loose Nut, among other records. To return the favor, I endured seeing Paul Young, Howard Jones, and Joe Lynn Turner. Not at the same show, thank God, but different shows. We eventually found, common ground with bands like U2 and The Cure, who we saw a number of times. The problem with music at this point, at least for me, a confused, terrible at relationships, even in my first one, type of kid who took everything personal. Music immediately would get attached to situations and people. This would go on through my 20s, getting into relationships, exchanging mixtapes, and having songs you both dig, getting then forever attached to that person, sometimes ruining it forever. At one point, maybe in my 40s, all of those were like magically erased from my head, and any type of sentimental attachment a song had at one point was so distant, I couldn't even remember who or what a song reminded me of. This is good and bad, especially for talking about music. I love the discussion of why someone loves a song or why something means so much to them. Maybe when it's just something simple like, this reminds me of this person I was in love with who hurt me, is such a cliche, it doesn't hold any weight for me anymore. With this podcast, I've gotten to talk to musicians I've loved since I was a teenager and ask them about music or experiences that fueled them to do what they do now or what makes them feel something. Or just, talking to my friends on here who aren't necessarily household names about their favorite music. All of these conversations and experiences have made this worth doing for sure. The 80s new wave alternative, what have you, was made for couples and mixtapes. If you never gave someone a tape with Just Like Heaven on it, were you really ever in love with them? I mean, probably not. It was just a phase, really, and they, ended up hooking up with your friend and eventually moving out of state. So, you dodged a bullet there. Just like heaven was saved for the next person in line. Well done, young romantic. At some point, I imagine I went to more shows of this type than hardcore shows. Probably sometime in the late 80s, as this is also when I stopped going to a lot of shows, as I was now what is commonly known as a deadhead. I saw the Grateful Dead around 30 times between July of 1989 and June of 1995. These two worlds were risky places to mix, at least on the punk rock side. I never hid being a punk person when seeing the Dead, and yeah, I wore my share of Dead shirts, but also would wear plenty of, Dead Kennedys and Black Flag shirts to Dead shows. To me, the people were a bit similar, at least in the, being a culture outside of the norm. I never picked up on the Black Flag Dead connection until later on. And, the main reason I never talked much about the Dead with people in the hardcore scene was the general consensus was always negative. You'd be hard-pressed to find anyone admitting they liked the Dead at this time. I remember there was a band called Max Creek, who were considered one of the first jam bands outside of the Dead, or rather the first heavily influenced by the Dead band. And I went to see them at the Paradise, and my old friend Keith Bennett, who's a multi-appearance guest on this podcast, was working the door and laughed and said something like, "What the hell are you doing here?" And I probably lied and said my friend dragged me there or something, and just went into the show, and then whatever. In retrospect, that band was not very good. I know, people in the jam band world still dig them, but I could never really get into them. It wasn't until recent years, though, where mixing of genres like jam bands and punk rock would be okay. And you can thank music festivals for this. I'm probably far past music festivals at this point, but for a while now, people have been able to go to a festival and see bands of all genres. And the lines between types of music fans are blurred. I think this is great, and, as much as that perhaps would have been a little easier to manage when I was younger, it was nice to feel like you were part of some team or secret club. My time as a deadhead also overlapped my time calling myself a skinhead for a little bit. This would never stick. I never loved oi music. I never really got into fights. I didn't really enjoy drinking beer. And frankly, having to do your laces up like that all the time just gets fucking tiring. And then, trying to remember what color laces you had to have on. Good Lord. There was a time when some idiots spray painted some things you should probably not spray paint on a temple in Marblehead, Mass. And the newspaper printed something about it and mentioned skinheads. Me being the young mansplainer I felt like I needed to be at 19, wrote a letter to the newspaper explaining there were other types of skinheads. The usual, well, the original skinheads were, yada. The newspaper decided they wanted to do an article on us and came to my house and interviewed us about being sharp skinheads against racial prejudice, and took some pictures of us. In one picture of me holding my fists with all of these crazy rings in front of an American flag, you can clearly see a Smith's Strange Ways Here We Come record flat above the flag. Yeah, right next to the 3 feet high and rising one. That skinhead phase was more of a fashion one for me, and I did not last long calling myself that. It wasn't until years later, while doing this podcast, in fact, that I connected the two. I did 2 episodes of a podcast called Skullfuck with a guy where we were talking about people from the punk and hardcore worlds who were also deadheads. I thought it was a cool idea, but he disappeared into thin air at one point, and so did that idea. I'd like to talk about that more on this podcast, for sure. The episode I did with Drew Stone, he talks a lot about being a deadhead on that episode. That was supposed to be for that Skullfuck podcast, but I ended up using it. So there. I guess what I'm trying to get at with all of this is it's nice to just talk about your passion for music or art or whatever it may be. I stopped believing in guilty pleasures a long time ago, that and negative talk about music. I honestly don't care what people think is overrated or what they just don't get. It's easy to shit on things you don't get or just don't feel like being you just feel like being a curmudgeon about. But to me, it's more rewarding talking about what you like and why you do. That's been a whole thing for me doing this. Nowadays, admitting you're a Kiss fan can, generate a negative reaction, mainly because Gene Simmons is kind of an asshole, and secondly, the lyrics aren't the greatest. But I've never been a huge lyrics person. Some music I listen to with the lyrics, and some I don't. I'd say, most music I listen to I can't relate to at all on any kind of personal level. If you listen to enough episodes of this, you'll find that a good chunk of people started off with Kiss. In fact, this may be the #1 most discussed band on this podcast, if we're being real. I still listen to the band all the time, and yeah, I cringe when Christine 16 comes on and maybe laugh at the stupid lyrics to, something like I Love It Loud. But I still find time to listen to them all these years later. So basically, what we have here in this podcast is a safe place for people like you in the Kiss Army, Deadheads, Goths, disco fans, and hey, even REM fans. Speaking of which, we've run out of time, no pun intended, and I still haven't talked about that band. Maybe episode 200 I will. Thanks for listening, and remember, not everyone can carry the weight of the world.